Prophets, penance, and promise. How many of you know a whole lot about the major prophets? Any experts in Ezekiel? Do you ever get to go to church and you hear these prophets preached about? Probably not a lot. Hopefully you're going to get a little bit of education today. Maybe a little bit of inspiration and a little bit of hope. But as you already heard, I came back from this mission trip to Detroit, and I couldn't help but think to myself, you know, it's really difficult to prepare a sermon when you're gone all week on a mission trip. Because your brain is somewhere else. And you're doing something else. Your hands are busy, your mind's busy, you're sharing joint time together, you're always in community. You don't have a lot of time as a pastor to sit in silence, meditate, prayerfully prepare. But I will tell you, this week was of God's design to have me in a place like Detroit that in so many ways felt like what I was going to be preaching about. Because I remember we got there, and the first thing you do is you walk in and you assess. I mean, you look at the community, you look at the home that you have, and you think to yourself, okay, God, why have you planted me here? What's going on right here, right now? And in this particular case, you look at the disaster, the mess, the brokenness, the rubble, and you begin to think, what pieces can we restore and bring life to in this moment? And, I mean, we walked in, and we looked and we saw that the floor had been covered, and they had actually taken out 4 foot of wall around. So we were going to be in charge of putting 4 foot of wall, sheetrock, back up against the wall, and mudding, taping, and painting. And in one room we had to completely redo the floor tile, and actually the ceiling had gotten so moldy from what had sat in the basement for a period of time that we had to pull down all the ceiling tile and put that back up. And we begin to think, wow, this is a bit of a task. What can we get done? And I began to think, you know, I'm preaching on Ezekiel this week. I'm preaching on these major prophets. And I realized, you know, what was taking place in this time frame for the kingdom of Israel might have been so much like what was going on in the Old Testament during the time of these major prophets. And so I got to thinking, you know, in fact, I'm going to put a slide up on the screen. It gives you a little bit of a timeline of what was actually taking place. You notice up there, before David was Moses, but you get to this Davidic dynasty where there was this time where people were living in Israel and they were self-ruled, and for the most part, people thought things were okay. They thought, this is good. This is a blessing, and they lived there in for the most part, lack of too much outer stress. But they did, you know, struggle. In fact, they had some inner tension. And eventually, if you know what was going on, the northern kingdom, 10 tribes out of the 12 began to break off, and they became known as the northern kingdom. And then Judah was left in the southern kingdom, just the 2 tribes down in Jerusalem. And they were in tension. And the northern kingdom began to become overrun by the Assyrians. All that was left hanging on was Judah and the area around Jerusalem. And during this time period, we begin to hear from the prophets of Isaiah and Ezekiel, Jeremiah and Daniel. And what's taking place now is the kingdom of Babylon is coming in. And these prophets are preaching doom, destruction. They're preaching that things are going to fall apart. And they're preaching it's all going to fall apart because of your unfaithfulness, because there was turmoil, because you began splitting and dividing, but because you were sinful and you were dishonoring God and disobedient to God, and they began to proclaim this message of destruction. Now, to give you clarity, this destruction begins to take place in 597 when Judah is also finally overrun by Babylon, and they take people into exile. They take all the best of the best, all the educated, those leaders of the nation. They take them into exile. Now, some of this you might know. Have you heard of the names of like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego? See, Sunday school is good for stuff. You hear these names, you remember them. Well, those are people who were brought into exile and living in Babylon actually as teachers, actually as people who were counseling the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar and otherwise. Well, you know what? Ezekiel was also taken as a leader. Somebody who had been raised up to be a leader in the temple was taken to Babylon. So when we look at these four prophets, we think Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Daniel. Isaiah and Jeremiah, they were left in Jerusalem. They were left in their kingdom. And I want you to realize it's in rubble. It's falling apart. The nation's divided. People are living in the ruins that are there. You find out more about it when you get to Ezra and Nehemiah, and they go back, and there's nothing left standing. The temple is gone. The wall is gone. It was 586 when Jerusalem was finally totally destroyed. People are scattered and lay in ruins. I thought to myself, that's a little bit like what took place even in Detroit, when the population drops from 6 million to 600,000, when the whole consistency of the nation is changed. When the homes are falling apart, the businesses are empty, when the buildings are crumbling. And I began to realize this might be God's timing. God's timing for me to experience and be in that kind of space where I can realize how it all fit together and see it in our current day. What would it have been like to be forced to continue to live in that kind of scenario? So Ezekiel is in the kingdom of Babylon, and he's prophesying. He's 25 when he's taken into exile. He was born in 623. Then it's 30 when he receives his first prophetic words. And I'm going to quote from that in just a second. And then he's 52 when he receives his last prophetic words. And the interesting thing about the book of Ezekiel, it's actually considered to be the book that is actually most true to form. It's written by Ezekiel. Pretty much, they're sure that that's completely his words. Completely his prophecy. Whereas if you go to Isaiah or Jeremiah or Daniel, some of these, they think that, the scribes or others have infused a few of their own or words from other prophets that have just kind of mingled in amongst the text. But Ezekiel is pretty true to form. Some things that you may not know about Ezekiel, which, by the way, it's a good book, but you have to read and understand it's prophetic, it's symbolic. There's things that you won't necessarily understand. Some things that he does, it's interesting. He has to lay on his side 390 days on the left side, symbolizing each day symbolizing a year in exile and slavery. And on the right side, then he has to, and that's for the northern kingdom. The 390 days is for the northern kingdom. Then on his right side, he has to lay on his right side for 40 days to represent and symbolize a year each for the exile of the southern kingdom, for Judah, before they get to return. He also had a wife that he loved. And God said, you're going to watch your wife die. The same day that Jerusalem falls, which was 586, on that day is the day that your wife will die, and you will not mourn. Because you are to be an example to the people of Israel that they should not mourn for Jerusalem. And he goes on to say, it is my justice for your disobedience. He has some pretty challenging things to read, but he has some pretty hope-filled things to read too. This first passage actually comes from one of the first main sections I want to talk about. When Ezekiel is receiving his call, when he's told what he's supposed to be about and do it, it says this: his commissioning is God says, I am sending you to the sons of Israel, to a rebellious people who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. So Ezekiel's purpose is to go and say, you guys are sinners. You guys have transgressed against God. You're going to receive some bad news. Now, as a pastor, let me just say, you don't really like to be the person that stands out in the street corner and says, you guys are all sinners and going to hell. You like to offer hope. But God's telling Ezekiel, just like all these other major prophets, you're going to be the bearer of bad news. You're going to have to go to these people and tell them this. So then chapters 4 through 24, 20 chapters, he goes on to say Ezekiel's message is for doom for the captives. And he shares several parables. He compares Israel to an adulterous woman. And then he says in this passage, chapter 16, verse 58. He says, he taught them that God was cleansing his chosen nation. He says, you have borne the penalty of your lewdness and the abominations the Lord declares. Okay, they're being punished. But the punishment is a good thing because it's actually about cleansing them because they're God's chosen nation. God is getting them ready to restore them, to do something different. So the passage begins to, even though it's confronting them for their abominations, he's beginning to say, but you are being cleansed for purpose. And I want to point out in this passage, in this whole section, these 20 chapters, there's something that takes place that I wish I had more time to go into, but I don't. There's this thing called the Holiness Code. You might be familiar with it a little bit because it is actually what, from Ezekiel on, really shaped Judaism. And what the shape of Judaism was in Jesus' day, this is where it was shaped from. And in fact, much of what Orthodox Judaism today is formed and shaped based upon these holiness codes. You know, things like how they had to wash their hands, things they couldn't eat, things that were unclean, the way that they had to go into the temple or how far they could go into the temple, what they could touch or couldn't touch, how they had to do the sacrifice. All of these things were very much considered the holiness code. They're based out of Leviticus. Ezekiel took and reframed those, and he preached to this unholy and broken Israel at this point. And he says, this is why you're being punished. It's because you've disobeyed all of these things. You've made yourselves unclean before God. You've made yourselves personally unclean. You've made yourselves as a nation unclean before God. And he says, this is what you got to get right. So Ezekiel and Leviticus, and Ezekiel's interpretation of Leviticus is what becomes their holiness code that then shapes Judaism so rigidly based upon these laws up through Jesus' time and even today for much of Judaism. Chapter 25 through 32, he begins to preach against those outside nations who push in and who had destroyed them. But then he changes it in chapters 33 through 48. He changes the message in a way that most of the other prophets don't. Whereas before it's all talking about, death and destruction and because of their abominations and sin, he begins to turn things around in this passage that I shared with you earlier. And it begins to talk about Israel as a nation, as being reborn, restored, the coming Messiah, the new temple, and in fact the kingdom of God, even talking about things that are again quoted in Revelation as the coming kingdom of God. This passage in chapter 37 says, he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, Lord, you know. When I got to Detroit, I asked myself a little bit, God, what are you going to do to restore this city? Even one home, we can go in and fix one home up a little bit and repair even just some of the recent damage, but God, what are you going to do to restore the whole of the city? I think sometimes we even look at our own lives. Have you ever done that? You look at your life and say, God, what are you going to do to restore me? Because right now I feel broken. Right now my job is falling apart, or I've got health issues, or my family is struggling. I feel like I'm living in rubble and ruins. God, what are you going to do? One part of our task was putting up ceiling tile. Thank the Lord, I stayed away from that one. I ended up in the other room doing floor tile. That was much better. If you guys ever put together those ceiling tile, not the hanging kind, those I like those. Those are kind of nice. But these square 12-inch tile that are just like cardboard, like paper. I mean, you tack them up and you kind of got to get them pushed in and nice and square together. Then you tack them up with staples. And then you go to the next one and push it in tight and tack it up with staples. And you do this. And the guys that were doing this, they tacked the rows up. And they got like 4 rows in. And they're like, this is going good. And then they stood back and looked at it and go, whoa, that's not straight. And they began to realize, oh, this is crooked and this is clear off. So they had to pull those 4 rows down. And they did this 3 times. Put them up, tore them down, put them up, tore them down. Finally, they're like, okay, and so they found something that worked, and it still was off, but they said, this will have to do. Have you ever just felt like in your life, it's like, I'm trying to put things back together, God. Just make it fall into place. God, I'm trying to put this piece and just hold it where it needs to be, but it seems to never be quite lined up right. I think sometimes that's what life feels like. I can imagine for the Jews living in exile at that moment, for those who were going through that, whether they were living in Babylon as servants or whether they were in Jerusalem living amongst the rubble, whatever their circumstance, I can imagine they were just thinking, God, what are you going to do to put this back together? God, what are you going to do to put me back together? My family, maybe in their circumstance, maybe half of my family was taken, half of them were left, maybe some of them were killed. God, what are you going to do to put us back together? And God turns to this passage that offers hope, where he gives this symbolic image of this valley of dry bones, a lot of bones, and they're very dry. They're brittle. There's no life, no marrow left in them. And I can imagine Ezekiel looking at them and you would want to answer and say, God, there's no life in those. They can't live again. But God, who is the creator, who created Adam from the dust, who creates us from nothing, God said those bones are the structure of a nation. Those bones may be the structure of our lives. Even though they may feel like there's no life left in them, like there's no hope, God made a point of saying to Ezekiel, breathe the Spirit into them. Prophesy to them. And by the very words of God, the words that God spoke to Ezekiel, he breathed new life into those bones. And he said, they will have life. And they stood even as a great army. Sinew, flesh, breath. Ezekiel reminds us that no matter what kind of destruction, rubble, exile we feel like we're living in, that there's hope. There's hope, there's possibilities, there's life, that God is the one who controls the life that is being breathed back into us if we will trust. The real interesting part about Ezekiel is, you know what he did not know? Is that it would take 2,500 years before Israel would truly be its own nation again, 1948, be its own nation and sovereign within itself. But not only that, Ezekiel closes with this word in chapter 43, which I didn't get on the screen, but it says this, and I want you to imagine the new kingdom, the heavenly kingdom. For those of you who are going to, 20 plus of us that are going to Israel next year, we'll be actually seeing this eastern gate that it talks about here, and it's actually referenced in the book of Revelation as well. It says, then he led me to the gate facing east, and behold, the glory of God, the God of Israel, was coming from the east. And the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision that I had seen when he came to destroy the city. And just like the vision that I had seen by the channel, I fell on my face. And as the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. You know, Israel had thought that God had abandoned them. All the people of Israel thought that God had left for good, that they were nothing but dry bones that had been crumbled and destroyed. And yet Ezekiel has this vision. He's very different than the other prophets because he has this vision of not just destruction, but this vision of hope, restoration, and new life and breath of the Spirit of God refilling, rekindling. And it's on multi-levels because it's always personal. It's about our own individual lives. It's about the church, and it's about the kingdom, the nation, and in fact, it's about the kingdom of God, which is to come, the heaven. So I want to tell you, Whatever it is that you're facing, whatever challenges you know, I want to remind you, God is there in the midst of it to breathe life into those dry bones. That even when you see no hope and you see despair, God still kindles that new life in each one of us. So my challenge this week is to allow God into those arid, those broken spaces in life, those places that you feel you've been abandoned, those spaces that you feel are dead. And even pray over them and say, God, as you asked Ezekiel to prophesy over those bones, Lord, I prophesy over these dry spaces in my life. God, breathe fresh life into them once again. Because God does offer hope in those spaces. Would you pray with me?